Good day, everyone. My name is Nick Robbins, and I'm delighted to be with you today to launch the Just Transition Finance Roadmaps project. This is a really exciting project which is exploring how finance can support climate action with positive social impacts, focusing on India and South Africa. I just wanted to highlight, before we get into the main proceedings, the 7 organizations that come together to launch this event. First, we have CDC, the UK's DFI, which has been really behind a lot of this work. We then have the National Business Initiative from South Africa, and also the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategy TIPS, also from South Africa. From India, we have the Observer Research Foundation and also the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy. And then we have the Initiative on Responsible Investment at Harvard Kennedy School, and then my own organization, the Grantham Research Institute at the LSE. So in the next few minutes, I just want to give you a brief introduction to why we're here, the focus of the project, and then I'll just run through the agenda so you can see the lineup we have for you. So just here, for many of you on the call, I think you'll have been addressing issues around climate change and sustainable development, and I think increasingly recognizing the importance of the just transition. I think all the work of the partners on this project, recognizing we're really not going to win in terms of climate action without a just transition, that this is an essential factor for climate success. And what does this mean? This means that the interests of workers and communities are placed at the heart of decision making, so that the benefits and costs of climate action are shared fairly. No one is left behind, and everyone is brought forward. So that's the first. This is absolutely strategic and central for climate action. I think the other thing is that this is a whole economy priority. This is something clearly that is covering sectors, high risk, high carbon sectors that will need to transition out, but also those sectors that are going to be transitioning into growing net zero opportunities. And really all those sectors are going to need to have a just transition approach so that core labor and human rights standards in particular can be realized in this process of quite transformational change. And then finance can play a a critical role, which is why we're here today. Clearly, governments have the primary responsibility that was outlined in the Paris Agreement, and business and trade unions also are central to making the just transition a reality. But it's really striking over the last few years a recognition that more and better quality finance will be needed, particularly to support place-based action. The just transition will be realized in very different ways in different regions and parts of the world. Our estimate, and it's probably now more than this, there are probably over nearly 200, maybe over 200 now, investors, banks, and development finance institutions are now committed to a just transition in their work. So what's the role of our project? So this project has been being developed over the last few months or so, but really was responding to a recognition that many of the challenges and indeed the opportunities of just transition are greatest in large emerging economies. Most of the financial response to date on the just transition has focused on industrialized countries here in Europe, in North America, and in Australia, and so on. But really, if we're going to make a success and rise to the challenge, we're going to need to focus on key emerging economies, particularly given the underlying issues around poverty, around inequality, and around livelihood development. And obviously, all of this has been intensified by the COVID-19 crisis. What does this project do? We focus particularly on India and South Africa, and we'll hear from team members on this. And the aim is to develop finance roadmaps for these countries. And these are being developed by experts in India and South Africa, and then through an international collaboration. So that's where the LSE comes in, and where Harvard also comes in. And we have a focus. We want to identify where future investment is needed for a just transition, and then crucially, how this can be delivered and mobilized so that we maximize the social and economic benefits of climate action. I think we're really ambitious in this project, and we're really focused. We want to identify both practical steps and also longer term pathways. So we have national teams, and you'll hear from them, and also international advisors. And we want to really focus on real world actions that can be taken this year in 2021 really to build up the confidence and credibility in the role of finance. This is a credible contribution to the just transition. And we obviously want to do that in the run up to COP26 this November. But also, this is not a short-term exercise. This is going to be a process of change over many years. And so obviously, we on this roadmap will be setting out what needs to be happening really in the rest of the 2020s. So in terms of the menu we have before you, we'll first kick off with a zero carbon fireside chat with Nick O'Donoghue, who's the Chief Executive Officer of CDC, and we'll really set the scene, the strategic context for this. Then we'll have two sets of opening remarks, firstly from Joanne Yawitch, who is the CEO of the National Business Initiative in South Africa, and then we'll turn to Rathin, the MD for Research and Policy at the Overseas Development Institute. I'll then hand over to David Wood, Director of the Initiative Responsible Investment at Harvard, who will have a panel discussion. Amal-Lee, Amin, who runs the climate change area for CDC, Rudi, a board member for TIPS, and then Royston Braganza, who's the CEO for Green Impact in India. And this is the moment where you can ask your Q&A, so please send your questions through the Q&A function, and then David will present those questions to the panelists. And then we'll wrap up with some closing remarks from Sharanjali Tandon, who is Assistant Professor at NIPFP in Delhi in India. So thanks very much. That's the introduction. And then I think without further ado, we'll move on to the discussion with Nick O'Donoghue, please. Thank you. Again, thanks very much, I think, for CDC's leadership in this area. Really what I wanted to kick off for you as CEO of CDC, why is the just transition really so important? Why is it such a focus for you as a DFI?
Well, good. Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure also for CDC to be hopefully playing a catalytic role in this discussion. And I'd like to thank all our project partners that Nick mentioned for participating in this with us. And I think, Nick, in answer to your question, why it's an area for focus, and I think you captured this actually in your introductory remarks. You know, we talk a lot about the critical importance of investing to mitigate the climate emergency. And of course, it's critical. We need vast amounts of capital to do that. But it's really important as we do that we think about how we're aligning finance and the decisions we make around capital investment and to ensure that we have a just transition to a greener economy. And that means really understanding more about and thinking more carefully about where we invest. It means about thinking more carefully about how we invest. And it means really, as we're trying to do today or starting today, to constructing a roadmap, a finance roadmap that we can use to get there. And, you know, from CDC's perspective, when we started really thinking in detail about the evolution of our climate strategy, I guess over the last couple of years, we announced that strategy about 6 months ago now, and there were really three key components to it. The first component was a commitment to be net zero by 2050. And that's a commitment not just on a portfolio level, around the whole portfolio, but also on an individual transaction level to make sure that everything we do is consistent with a pathway to net zero. And the second area that we wanted to focus on was the question of adaptation and resilience, because we know some degree of climate change is going to happen. We know that the most vulnerable, the people most vulnerable to climate change are those that are living and working in our geographies, and our geographies for CDC or Africa and South Asia. So we wanted to make sure that we were investing not just in mitigation, but also in adaptation and resilience. But thirdly, the third part of our climate strategy was this focus on a just transition, and we think it fits very well overall with the CDC's capabilities. Firstly, because we are an investment institution, we commit, an average about $2 billion a year. Every time we make an investment decision going forward, we need to be thinking as we always do, about the development outcomes we're seeking to achieve, but we need to be thinking about how do we do that in the context of a just transition. And I think when people talk about building back better, this is really this is one of the things that's at the heart of building back better. It also is the just transition is naturally aligns with some of the other key areas of focus within CDC around when we think about our developmental impact. So we spend a lot of time thinking about job quality. We spend a lot of time, have done a lot of work on gender equality and gender investing and skills development, and all these things touch on and are pertinent to the discussion around the just transition. And also CDC, as we're an investment institution, we make our direct investments, but also we're a very important indirect investor, meaning we invest through funds. We're the largest, for example, the largest private equity fund investor in Africa. We invest through banks as intermediaries. So we have influence on these other, in addition to our own investment activities, we have influence on these other organizations, these other investment institutions. So it allows us to sort of shape the just transition agenda in a more scalable way over and above what we're doing. And I suppose final point on development finance institutions, we're obviously the UK's development finance institution. And we think that just transition needs to be at the forefront, sort of as the next frontier of climate action. I think DFIs broadly, both multilateral and bilateral, have put a significant amount of capital over the last decade or so into obviously renewable energy, and had a real focus, I think, up to now on mitigation and how we can have more solar energy, more wind energy. Increasingly, we are moving obviously to adaptation and resilience, as I mentioned, and thinking about how, given the people we're investing in support of are, as I said, the most vulnerable to climate change, how we can do more to help them adapt and become more resilient. But also, as DFIs, we need to focus on the social dimension of climate change. How does it affect people's lives day to day? How can we, as you said, help to create the jobs of the future in the green economy? So all of those reasons, I think, for all of those reasons, this is a very, I think, obvious and also important area for CDC and I think other development finance institutions to be focused on.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, Nick. I mean, I like the way actually this sort of the climate area really comes together with your sort of long-standing focus on job quality and skills and gender. That's really clear. So that's the vision. You launched your strategy last year, 6 months ago, which I think was really good. It'd be really good to unpick that a little bit and look under the bonnet, let's say, and say, how are you actually turning that strategic sort of aspiration into practice across your portfolio and activities? Could you sort of say a bit more about that, and maybe a couple of examples?
Yes. Well, the obviously key is how we work with our portfolio. CDC has investments across 1,200 companies, principally in, as I said, in Africa and South Asia, and so that gives us the opportunity to really test scalable approaches to just transition across our portfolio. So think about more carefully how we can support businesses in the green economy to create decent, sustainable, high quality jobs, and particularly how we can help develop skills to support those jobs, particularly among those most in need, particularly among the most vulnerable, particularly in the sort of lower income parts of the countries in which we invest, and also particularly and importantly among women. So we've been doing that, and then we've also been trying, because obviously we have a broad investment portfolio across many different sectors, but we've been trying increasingly to prioritize our time and our capital and tilt our attention towards sectors like energy infrastructure, obviously, like food and agriculture, and particularly forestry, like circular economy, manufacturing. So these sectors and subsectors that are really have the greatest potential to contribute to this just transition. And if I can, I'll give you a couple of examples. IANA is a company that we at CDC set up about 4 years ago in India, with an objective of developing renewable, principally solar energy. Today, it's got over a gigawatt has developed over a gigawatt of solar energy. It has ambitions to double or treble that over the next 2 or 3 years, and obviously, there's a vast need for solar in power in India. But what we've been able to do as part of that investment is to develop a skills training program. One of the things that's specific about IANA, one of its objectives was to try to go to the poorer states, in the less well-developed states in India. And there's a real opportunity, obviously, when you do that, alongside the capital that goes into the sort of the capex that goes into developing the solar project or whatever. There's a real opportunity to develop training programs, skills programs, particularly to help rural youth to access some of these jobs. So we've been doing that in our project in Andhra Pradesh. We now there's another project, a subsequent project in Rajasthan. Which we expect will probably be able to scale up to 1,000 local people. And again, given the issues, given the migrant crisis now in India as a result of COVID, there's a real need for skills training, and there's a real opportunity within these new and emerging this new and emerging sector to do that. Another African example is in Myro Forestry. It's a company we invested in a number of years ago. It has a sustainable forestry and timber business in Ghana and Sierra Leone. Supports about 2,000 formal jobs last year. We expect that to probably double over the next couple of years. And as the business grows, you're creating more jobs in areas like harvesting and processing. So we've put in place a specific action plan, a gender action plan, to make sure as many of those that we can increase as much as possible the proportion of women in the workforce. And this has not traditionally been an area where women have made up a significant part of the workforce. And forestry will not just for us, but I think broadly for all investors, will become a more important part of our investment portfolio, and it is a key area where we can action sort of the just transition. And I suppose the final thing I'll say on what we've been doing is we have been working within the development finance community. We're a member of the European Development Finance Institutions. We worked on the steering group to publish a statement on climate and energy finance in November of 2020. And the idea there is to try to bring that community together. Obviously, they're very focused on climate finance. They've done a lot in mitigation, but push the community more, as I said, into adaptation and resilience, but particularly ensuring thinking about a just transition. And that's not just investing in these companies, but it's also in across your whole portfolio, thinking about how you can help aid the transition.
Great. Well, it's really good to get those practical examples, Nick. I think it brings them to life. So maybe just in the last minute or so, really, what next? I mean, it's in your strategy. You've got some of these examples, but actually, what next in terms of just transition and finance for you?
Well, we know we can play a role in mobilizing capital. We know that capital can play a role in helping to stimulate sort of the clean and inclusive growth, support the green recovery, particularly post COVID-19. And we've decided, one of the things obviously that we can do is help to catalyze attention on the just transition, and that's why we're doing what we're doing today with all of you, to try and catalyze the finance roadmap, particularly in this starting initially in Africa and India. So that's we see that as an important step forward. We've got COP26 this year in the UK. It's going to be an important showcase for what needs to be done. And so we want to put just transition at the top of that agenda. South Africa and India, hugely important priority, will be hugely important priority countries, particularly as there's so much to do in transitioning from coal to renewables in those countries. It's also an important year for CDC because it's the last year of our 5-year strategy. And we are building and working on developing a new strategy for the next 5 years. And we need to understand and think about how we're going to invest to ensure we meet that net zero target and meet the other commitments on our climate and our climate strategy. And it's also relevant outside. Obviously, here today we're starting with India and South Africa. It's also relevant outside those countries. We have investments, for example, across 34 countries in Africa. So we want to take that and broaden it. So, I suppose final comment. This is we're delighted to have the opportunity to sort of catalyze and stimulate this project. I know there's lots of other potential funders on listening to this today. So I mean, we'd love company, and we'd urge as many of you as possible to step forward and hopefully support this initiative alongside us.
Well, Nick, thanks very much. Thanks very much for your leadership in this and giving us a bit of a sense about what just transition means in practice. And thanks to you who've been actually starting to populate the Q&A function. I see someone anonymous has sent in a question about definitions. Clearly, just transition is in the Paris Agreement. We have the ILO guidelines on just transition from 2015 also. But I think the key in all of this, and it was very much emphasized in the Paris Agreement, that this has to be done at a national level to really make sure that just transition comes to life in particular national context. So I think that's the real strength, I think, hopefully, of this project. So we're going to move on, Nick. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick.
And have our two interventions just to build on that. First, we'll have Joanne, and then we'll have Rathin. So if we could put up the screen for Joanne, and Joanne's message will be recorded. So if we can have her message. Thank you very much.
South Africa is a country that is likely and is being already heavily impacted by climate change. And the second thing is that it has an energy intensive economy, and hence is a relatively high greenhouse gas emitter. And when you put those two things together, you have a situation in which, firstly, we need to ensure that our resilience is built in the economy to the impacts of climate change, and that vulnerability is reduced. And in that context, the notion of a just transition, I think, goes far beyond the energy sector and includes workers in agriculture. It includes the biodiversity economy, which is a really big issue in South Africa. It includes the people who work in relation to our water resources. And then obviously it includes the energy sector. And that means that when we're talking about a just transition, we're looking at how our economic activities right across the board adapt to changing circumstance. And so the notion of not leaving anyone behind in a context where there's very high levels of unemployment and poverty and inequality, as there are in South Africa, becomes particularly important. So the energy transition demands that we look at the people who are in the energy value chain, and we look at, if we are going to transition our economy to a low carbon path, then what are we going to do to ensure that we skill, we transform, we innovate, we research, we build new industries that can absorb people. And then on the other hand, we're also looking at different means of and different ways of producing, so that we find new paths and new opportunities for people who otherwise would lose their livelihoods and their income as a result of climate impact. In relation to the role of finance in enabling a just transition in our country, as you know, the South African economy is not in a good state at the moment, and clearly the pandemic has made it much worse. But just before the pandemic, our economy was downgraded. So its sovereign credit rating is bad, and there is a situation in which without the kind of international financial finance capacity building and technological support, the ability of our economy at this point in time to be able to successfully ensure a just transition will be very limited. And so we need finance in South Africa. I think that we certainly believe that the kinds of climate finance mechanisms that have been set up internationally are an important source of finance for our country. But it's also about mobilizing the private sector and ensuring that the way that the private sector financiers and the financial services industry is structured is appropriate to be able to support and underpin a just transition. I think there are a lot of opportunities in South Africa. If we're looking at it, there's the issue of creating industries around electric vehicle production. Obviously, wind and solar enables the right kinds of conditions for green hydrogen, which is another zone of opportunity that would need financing. The platinum group metals in hydrogen and fuel cell use are important for us. And all of that could boost the mineral sector and really look at the possibilities of South Africa, for example, with the proper support, becoming a world leader in carbon neutral fuels. In order to maximize that opportunity of that and the potential of that, the roadmap on financing just transition in South Africa becomes critically important. Because you can't leave a transition like this to chance, given its complexity, both technically and socially. And it needs a carefully managed approach that maps the various sources of finance for key transition projects. So we think that there is a very strong business case for the energy transition, and the financial institutions need to both understand the opportunity and support it. But without the understanding of what to invest in, who to partner with, what other enabling conditions will be needed, these opportunities will simply pass us by. So I think that what we aim for in South Africa is to be on essentially, I think, a virtuous cycle in relation to the transition that we need. And finance is a critical component of this. And our stable and well-regulated and competitive financial sector really would make a strong base for green finance, not only for South Africa, but for the continent as well. And I think that when we're talking about a just transition, and when we're talking about the need for coordination, the need for thinking big, the need to prioritize a set of critical projects that would really enable the change we want to see, then the coordination between private and public, between the finance sector and the rest of industry becomes extremely critical.
Well, that was really good, and really thanks to National Business Initiative and Joanne for making that contribution. I think showing the scale of the challenge. This is real, but also those opportunities. So thank you for that. So we now have Rathin Roy live from India. Rathin, over to you for your thoughts and perspectives on this challenge and opportunity of just transition and the financial dimension. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Robbins, and good evening, everyone. I'm not going to speak just about India. And the reason for that is that, contrary to what one might think, there is nothing special about India's transition. It is embedded in a fundamental global injustice, at the root of which, and this is my first premise, is the narrowing of the focus of the transition problem from one of the environment to just climate. And I take issue with that, and I'll tell you why. When the Brundtland Commission report was produced when I was a very young man, even younger than now, the problem that it pointed out was twofold. We were consuming too much for the planet to be sustainable. And this was causing the destruction of the commons and therefore affecting the lives of people whose livelihoods and very humanities were intricately linked with the commons, not just in poor countries, but also in rich countries. But at the same time, there were far too many people in the world who didn't have enough to eat, who didn't have enough consumption. So the challenge was to equalize consumption and thereby protect the commons. Fast forward to now. The entire conversation is not about how much we consume, or more important, what we consume. It is how we manage to do so in a carbon neutral way. In that sense, therefore, one is indifferent as to whether a unit of energy is used to enable a German or a rich Indian or a rich South African to enjoy air conditioning or central heating and sit in their shirt sleeves in extreme weather, while the majority of their countrymen, in the case of India and China and South Africa, cannot afford that luxury, as long as that unit of energy is produced from renewables. So COP after COP, and I tried in Paris and I stopped going to COPs. I'll try again this year, depending on the outcome of this meeting. The question of financing became one of financing technologies that would enable people to maintain existing consumption patterns and not therefore impede anything. The magic bullet had been found, but that magic bullet required narrowing the conversation to one on climate. And that is, I think, the fundamental injustice. This also meant that finance was available to those who were able to utilize and deploy these technologies to maintain business as usual in the sense of what is consumed. So today, both in India and in the UK and in South Africa, the biggest fossil fuel producers are the biggest champions of renewable energy. We talk about cars, not public transport, because now we can produce them in a sustainable fashion and move them electrically. So it does not matter anymore whether you use public transport or cars, for we have electric cars, and thou shalt therefore be permitted to continue with private consumption. It does not matter whether you use a unit of electricity for a light bulb for a poor kid in school to read, or a unit of that same electricity to power up an air conditioner, as long as it is produced renewables. This is the profound injustice in climate, and I think the task of finance is to change the terms of this by including in their assessments and taxonomies not just how the energy for consumption is produced, but what is consumed. If you think about it this way, then the flows of finance would not be to automobiles, energy, renewable infrastructure. They would be far more to agriculture, to the built environment, to urbanization, to pollution, to water conservation, to biodiversity, which has very conveniently been separated out into its own COP. That energy transition would create employment. It would improve the welfare of people who were not benefiting from the state of iniquitous consumption that has landed us in this problem in the first place. And I therefore think the major challenge for finance is to make this transition. There are organizations doing it, and I hope Nick's project will take this on, but Climate Bonds Initiative, for example, has paid great attention in recent times in India, looking at the question of agriculture and sustainable zero-based natural farming systems. These have to be the conversations we see in the COP. What we are consuming and therefore where finance is being directed so that profitably without subsidies, we can change patterns of consumption and through that change patterns of production and make them more sustainable, thereby getting away from a unifocal focus on climate. Join me in the COP if you're willing to upend it by bringing up this proposition and taking it away from the climate ghetto into which it has unfortunately entered, which is at the root of the justice and fairness problem. Thank you.
Fantastic, Rathin, and really, really good in terms of challenging us. Interesting to note that actually when the ILO came up with its just transition principles, it didn't limit it to climate. It actually was environmentally sustainable development. So absolutely spot on there. And I think the question about where the finance has been directed and for what is absolutely essential. And I'm glad that I can now hand over to David and his panel to go into that, because I think you've touched on some really good things. So thank you, Rathin. David, I'm going to hand over to you, and we'll come back in a little while. And again, thanks for all of you putting your questions in the Q&A. This is the time when we can really start to address those. So David, over to you. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Nick. And we can get everybody, Rudi and Amal-Lee, there you are. That was great, Rathin, and really set up this conversation really well. And thanks to everybody else, Nick and Joyce and Nick, for introducing the topic. I'm David Wood. I work at the Initiative for Responsible Investment, which is a small research project at Harvard Kennedy School. And we've been working on the just transition for a while, specifically as it relates to responsible and impact and sustainable investment, whatever name you want to put to it. A lot of it already in the question and answer, and please keep the questions coming. We'll get to them in a little bit, your questions for this panel and generally about the topic. People have already been talking about common definitions and what does just transition mean. And I don't think we're going to come to a common agreement on precisely what the topic means, but there's a family resemblance and a set of movements that has informed our work at the IRI on the topic that I think will come up in this conversation too. One, just transition grows out of the labor movement, and in particular, a focus on workers who are disadvantaged by transitions and the quality of work that comes with new industries and enterprises that are part of this transition. And the other one for us has been out of the environmental justice movement, and in particular, the different impacts and negative as well as positive on communities racialized by gender and so on. And that's kind of, I think, for me, it's the blend. But what I thought we'd start with is for the panelists here to introduce themselves and maybe give a sense of what just transition means in your context. Amal-Lee, I think we'll start with you. I know that we've got a little bit on CDC already, but if you can tell us sort of how it fits into your work and what you think of it and what you do at CDC.
Thank you, and it's great to be here with everyone. So yes, I'm Amal-Lee, Amin, Director of Climate Change at CDC Group. And I think as Nick, our CEO, Nick O'Donoghue mentioned earlier, I mean, just transition is one of our core pillars of our new climate change strategy for the very reason that I think we've heard Joanne, Yawitch and Rathin emphasize very clearly that we have to ensure that as we make any transition, that is socially just for workers and communities. But of course, from a climate perspective, we are in the process of trying to accelerate the transition out of certain sectors that are detrimental to a low carbon and resilient economy. And in particular, we in our strategy, we look at the energy sector as one of those sectors that is, of course, extremely important from a climate perspective, but also very important from the development agenda. And so we are recognizing that for particularly South Africa and India as two very important markets for CDC that have very extensive coal investments, not just for coal power, but also industry that is heavily reliant on coal and very carbon intensive. For those countries in particular, any form of climate action and a transition to net zero emissions, it has to be a transition that brings along new opportunities, brings along the new jobs, ensures that there are any potential negative impacts are minimized and reduced. And so that's very much, as a Development Finance Institute, as Nick emphasized earlier, that's very much why we have made this a priority for our climate strategy, and builds on, of course, our long experience in how we work through our investments with our investees to actually create and good quality jobs in our markets. So for us, it seemed like a very logical issue to actually prioritize in the climate strategy. And I think why we're so interested in this project is because a lot of the focus on just transition has been mainly focused on some of the policy issues, which of course are extremely important. But as we know, given the urgency of climate change and the urgency of some of these issues, it's really important to help ensure that the finance and community is ready to also work with policymakers to actually intentionally invest in a way that can also support the just transition. And that's what's, I think, really unique to this particular project. So we're really happy and delighted to be working with such great partners as represented on this call to really, I think, do some really quite pioneering work in two such important countries.
Terrific, thanks. Yeah, it does seem sort of a natural, if development finance is going to tackle climate, it should be through a just transition lens. But also I want to highlight this, for us with the project, figuring out where finance fits into the broader interaction of multiple stakeholders across sectors is more important than figuring out what investors can do, in their portfolios. But both are part of the subject. Rudi, perhaps you can introduce yourself and say a little bit about how TIPS got to just transition.
Thanks so much, David. Rudi Dix, I'm a board member of the TIPS. I also work as the head of the project management office in the presidency of South Africa. And I've been involved in much of the work in the, when I was in the labor movement, I'd in actual fact been one of the team members spearheading the conversation 10 years ago on a just transition, and conceptually trying to unpack that from an emerging market South African context. So it's, when the ILO initially introduced this, we had been able to get quite a bit of people on board when we talked about a just transition. Transitions generally, as you know, are always disproportionately favor the ruling class, favors capital generally, firms, businesses. And of course, there's a disproportionate impact on workers, on communities, on small-scale farmers, on fisherfolk, on a whole lot of them. And I think it's useful for us to understand it. We all understand it. I think, David, your point here is that we all tend to see it and understand it differently. It's a nice phrase. It talks about, degrees of equality, the way we transition to a less coal-dependent, resilient economy. We should ensure that the kind of cost that is borne out of that transition is not placed on vulnerable workers and the poor. In reality, that's not always the case, as you may well know. I mean, if I go back and think about my participation in our climate change committee in the Congress of South African Trade Unions, which is the largest federation in South Africa, we had established a climate change committee specifically to look at the just transition. But as we engage with policymakers and business, it's quite clear that they didn't quite understand what it meant. They didn't quite understand that if you wanted coal miners, for example, coal workers or coal-dependent communities to buy into a just transition, then you have to talk about what happens to coal communities if we shift from a less coal-dependent economy. And in our context, there's one particular province which is in the east of South Africa, Mpumalanga it's called, and there's a coal belt where the vast majority of our energy is produced, coal-powered energy is produced. Large communities, workers who are dependent on mining for coal, transporting them on conveyor belts to coal-powered fire stations, which are a few kilometers away from them, right close to the mine. And all of them are dependent on that kind of economic ecosystem. So what happens to those workers? What happens to those communities that have been thriving and built on coal production? And of course, converting that into energy, right? And these are important areas that we need to talk about. So for us, it's not just about financing for a just transition that talks about development for investment in renewable energy, but it also talks about the critical questions about where these communities are not going to be adaptive, where they're not going to be able to shift easily to other forms of energy transition. There's no other forms of production over there. What do we do? Does finance for development for just transition mean trying to get communities in this particular parts of the world, which is in Mpumalanga on the east of our country, to be able to understand and buy? Are they going to support the just transition if they're here in 10 years time? In actual fact, we have 50 years left in this one mine, and in 10 years time or 20 years time, we're no longer going to mine coal. What does it mean for them? What does it mean for those workers, for small holders, for informal economic activity to workers? And I think this is quite critical kind of conversations that we have to have when we talk about the just transition. This is where we refer to as the disproportionality in the way a transition should happen. That it's fine to invest in these kind of sectors, but renewable sectors, because our objective is to move to a low carbon economy. But it's quite critical that we need to talk about what that transition means in the reality. So this is a very interesting topic. Even policymakers, I mean myself in a policy environment, struggle to grapple with, and to deal with our vastly dependent coal economy.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, for us, or at least for me, working here from the States, engaging with South Africa is to understand sort of how deep the just transition as a topic has been in the community, how long, I mean, people are even tired of it as a topic because of the real challenge of dealing with dislocation, especially in coal and energy. Thanks very much. I mean, it's great to have you here. Royston, the situation is pretty different in India. If you could talk a little bit about how you come to just transition and Grameen does, and maybe locate what a definition of just transition looks like to you.
Well, I can talk about transition, two transitions, and then you can decide whether it's just transition or just a transition. One is, of course, my own personal transition has been, to introduce myself, was started with Citibank and the corporate bank, and then investment bank, and then HSBC in the mid-market, and then SME, and then Grameen and rock bottom. So it's been the race to the bottom in some ways. And clearly that transition has been fairly stark and sometimes gradual, but whether it's just transition or just a transition, I don't know. The other has been Grameen's journey in India. Started in 2008 when we decided to see how we could look at microfinance. There were 400 million people below $2 a day in India. And we said, is there a need to create our own microfinance company and really serve them? Or is there something different? And we created Grameen Capital at that time, whose focus was, rather than creating our own microfinance company, let's look at the 100-odd NGOs who existed, who were doing microfinance in some form or shape, and help them to scale up. And because capital was their single largest constraint to growth, we said, let's create Grameen Capital to help to connect capital and these NGOs, and then transition them from NGO to for-profit to NBFC, from NBFC to bank. And that journey of NGO to for-profit to NBFC to bank has been a transition. Now, has that been a just transition? Again, there are many definitions, but we've been able to really see the role of capital in moving transition, in accelerating transition, in directing transition. And I think that's what energized us to create Grameen Impact 2 years ago, when we said, in some sense, our additionality in microfinance in India was negligible because we had already done what we had to do. I was the chair of the Indian Microfinance Network till 2 years ago, when our members reached 52 million women clients. So, about 300 million people served, close to the 400 million that we had as a dream when we started 10 years ago. And that number and the trajectory was going to hit it. So we said, what do we need to do next? And we created Grameen Impact because we said, how do we look at the same households, but now look at the adjacent sectors: water, sanitation, agri, forestry, clean health, affordable education, and bring those areas now into focus. Of course, it became fashionable later to be called impact investing. But when we looked at it very differently, we said, again, how do we bring debt capital to these social enterprises? And there's a question really from Harriet Lamb on the question on the Q&A, who's talking explicitly about this. How do we look at smaller enterprises? How do we look at, not looking at, and it's very fancy to say $100 million bonds, $500 million bonds, $500 million bond listed on a green exchange. And we've completely changed it and looking at it in a different fashion, much like 30 years ago, Professor Yunus looked at microloans. And we said, can we create micro bonds? And we've categorized or christened them as SDG impact bonds, focused on the SDGs. And we'll talk about that probably in the next iteration. But these are some of the transitions that we've done where we've seen capital as an influencer. And I think Nick Dono talked about this in his opening comment. How do we use the leverage we have, the influence we have through our various investing arms to be able to direct this type of capital, to be able to get the results we need? So I'll pause there for now, but I want to come back to the SDG impact bonds later.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks very much. That's great. So ordinarily, this is the time when I would hector the audience to put questions into the box, but you all are doing a great job with that. Keep them coming in. We're trying to keep track. I'm going to ask one more round here, and then we'll go to the audience questions. But what I'd like to do is kind of put Just Transition in your context, in your various contexts, and get into sort of the specific role of finance in that broader context. So Amal-Lee, even the first context we have is development finance. What changes for development finance if Just Transition becomes a focus? And in particular, what changes in you all's work in South Africa and India, taking on this topic?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we were already at CDC's, changing and focusing on this already. A lot of the work that Allegra in particular, who is here but not speaking at this event, Allegra Day, has been working with investees and helping to identify, ways in which we can provide more skills. There's one particular example in India, the Ayana platform, where been working particularly with women to build skills in the renewables sector in India. And, we see that as very much part of how we can support the just transition. I think, though, what's maybe a little bit different through as these roadmaps emerge or evolve, they'll be able to signpost much more clearly, how we should develop our investment strategies in a way that will be consistent with the just transition. So, for example, as Rudi said, the Mpumalanga region in South Africa, already one could say, well, that's an area that we should, as a DFI, and DFI should be, or whether it's the DBSA in South Africa, should be looking to create new economic opportunities, new jobs. And they may not be in the energy sector. I think sometimes we think, oh, you're going from coal to renewables, but those jobs and those opportunities may be quite different. And hopefully, as countries transition, make that low carbon transition, as well as also, Joanne, of course, emphasized the vulnerabilities of countries of South Africa and of India. We know that in some parts of those countries, we know particularly in India that, some small scale farmers may become increasingly vulnerable as well. But how do we work with them to enable them to move into, whether it's different types of crops, different types of farming, or other forms of economic opportunity. So it's really about being much more intentional and strategic around this, and then working with other investors, both domestic and international, to help them understand also. I think, as Nick said, Nick O'Donoghue said, and I know Nick Robbins has said this as well, that it's really the next frontier of an ESG investing, and recognizing that finance investors, impact investors, but all investors really are now increasingly looking to ensure the social dimension along with the environmental and governance dimension of investing. So this really can help signpost and provide a much more strategic view as to where we should be investing and how we invest.
Yeah, no, sort of ESG, in its conception was a holistic way to look at the social, value of finance, and became, for some, a sort of, spreadsheet with 3 different columns. We think just transition is bringing that back together. And I also we're going to come back to this too, but you highlighted the sort of just transition applies across all sectors. That's come up in questions several times. This isn't just an energy discussion. It's not just an agricultural discussion. Decarbonization is, I think, as Rathin pointed out, it's a a whole economy approach, and it isn't limited to just climate concerns. So Rudi, in South Africa, you have a business, labor, government, social dialogue that sort of stands out for its design to tackle an issue like just transition, as hard as it is. And then here comes finance. Could you say, a little more about how in South Africa there's this managing of the discussion, and also what role finance can play productively, and maybe what it shouldn't do to screw things up?
I'm not quite sure about how finance could screw things up, but there's many ways I can think about it. South African finance is very risk adverse. This is the strangest thing for well-developed financial markets that we have. Well-functioning stock exchange, banking system that's one of the best in the world. I suspect that the CDC project will find itself well at home. I suppose that before I come onto the tripartite social dialogue thing, I suppose that it would be important to think through, Amal, your point about the kind of investment that you'd make that would be slightly more risky investments. Right? because you're not quite sure what you do with those coal communities. Are you building new industries? Are you looking at new industrial development? These are the kind of questions that you would have to ask. Are you looking at new skills development? Do you need new infrastructure? A whole lot of different things. And I think these are the kind of things that are always risky and not easily palatable by financial markets, unless, of course, they significantly in partnership with IDC, as you say, or DBSA, Development Bank of South Africa, or some other form of development forms of finance. But I do think there's a given that we have well-established financial markets, I think it would be ideal situation to be able to find some of the forms of what Royston talks about, the greater forms of funding and financing, and that's the kind of thing that we need to work through. What sort of creative forms of funding that we we're able to manage risk adequately, and all of us take a bit of risk, and there are partnerships that develop. And South Africa is well known for partnerships. That's why we have the Social Dialogue Forum, David, which is called NEDLAC, National Economic Development Labour Advisory Council. And it's a tripartite structure made up of government, made up of workers. Actually, it's a four-partite, made up of government, workers, community organizations, and of course, business. And the financial sector as a component of business in an organized association is a member of the main business organization, which is BUSA, Business Unity South Africa. And a large component of what we talked about in the Just Transition, including setting up the Presidential Climate Change Coordinating Council, setting up various forms of institutions. Recently, TIPSAT recently just completed the NEVA study, the National Economic Vulnerability Assessment on coal communities. These are all been tabled in a conversation that happens at that social dialogue structure, which is a useful structure to be able to facilitate and bring through these kind of difficult conversations where there are going to be significant trade-offs that would have to be negotiated. So it works well to have that kind of conversation. But ultimately, it's how you cascade that kind of conversation, because South Africa is a country where you would have to engage not only at a national level, you'd have to engage at various tiers of the country. So at a provincial level, at a local level. So if you talk about any particular, if you talk about Amal-Lee, which is one of the coal-producing areas in Mpumalanga, you'd have to engage with communities there in the same way that you engage at a national level. So it's quite a useful and easy way to be able to get through some of the difficult conversations when you do have everyone in the room participating.
Yeah, and you make a great point about the sort of levels of integration as well. Like Just Transition's definitionally place-based. That part of that has to do with the political structures at the level of the nation, but then you have to be rooted in community to make it make sense. Royston, we sort of in India, Just Transition is a relatively new term rather than one that's been knocked around for a long time. Where do you see the opportunities for investors to integrate social and climate and environmental issues, in the sort of Indian political economic context?
So I see the opportunity as being enormous. I mean, I still remember when I was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly in 2018, one of the things that was bandied about was, $30 trillion, that's the gap for SDG financing. And if you just look at the Indian component of that, it could well be around, 5 to 7 trillion. And if you add South Africa, we're around, we would be in that $10 trillion need. And therefore, the need to be able to create products that could attract mainstream capital. I think that's really the key. How do we bring mainstream capital to fund the SDG goals? And that is something that in some ways, microfinance is a success story. So how do we replicate that into these other sectors? Affordable health, affordable education, water, sanitation, clean energy, agri, forestry. The key is, rather than just looking at mainstream capital, how do we look at the entire continuum? And how can we create, as Rudi talked about, creative and innovative ways of financing? Can we look at a blended finance model? Can we find CSR or philanthropy or HNIs to really de-risk the capital and allow crowding in of capital? And at that time, one of the things that struck me was that the only solution to SDG or impact people were talking about on the debt side was impact bonds. but they were SIBs and DIBs, and there was sort of five-star hotel discussions around, is it a SIB or is it a DIB, and hair splitting around taxonomy. And I was like, this is not happening. I mean, why are we looking at something that takes 2 to 3 years to get done? Because if you look at the SIBs and DIBs that were happening, it takes 2 to 3 years. And I committed in September at the General Assembly that we will do it in 3 months instead of 3 years. And literally in December 2018, we did the first SDG impact bond on Goal 5 for women, tribal women in rural Madhya Pradesh who are working in the forest to become poultry farmers. We did the second one within 3 months for creating 20,000 jobs, an SDG 8 bond on livelihoods. We did the third one again within 3 months on 5 and 8 together. We did the fourth one on Goal 7 on clean energy on a decarbonization bond. We did the fifth one on Goal 2 on agri practices and sustainable agriculture. And the difference is that these are tiny. These are $500,000 to $1 million. So we don't want to do a $100 million bond. We want to do hundreds of $1 million bonds. We want to create an SDG impact bond factory. And we want to keep churning out these bonds like we churned out microcredit loans. And we want to say, can we bring in more and more partners into this ecosystem? For example, in my food security bond, could Nestle or Kellogg or Unilever through their CSR say, if you are able to bring farm productivity up by X, then I'm interested in incentivizing that farmer. And then I will pick up through an incentive the coupon that he has to pay for the bond. So effectively, what we are doing is de-risking. So we say, for example, DFID or Rockefeller or someone provides a guarantee. So the same Gates or Rockefeller would have been putting a grant to be able to look at an agroforestry project. And then they would say, this is what the outcome has been. And we're saying, hey, Gates or Rockefeller, don't put that money. Keep that money as a guarantee. Grameen will put that money in as a loan. On the back of that, we will define the outcomes at the get-go. And then through the life of that bond, we will look for outcome funders who are interested in paying for success or performance. And at the end of that term, if they've met those outcomes and that money is paid by the outcome funders, they repay Grameen. And here, Rockefeller and Gates, your guarantee is not touched. And we now use it for Jharkhand and then Chhattisgarh and Uttar Pradesh and all the places that Nick Donovan talked about as the poorer states. So how do we look at creating those models? And we're getting interest from Argentina. There's a new climate change ministry that has been created. And they are saying, can we do something in the Misiones province there that's looking at the Amazon rainforest? And can we do something along with the Maori tribe in New Zealand? So can we do actually a South-South bond with Rudi and South Africa and India and create that, which is women working in communities in the forest, which is looking at solar energy at a micro level, which is looking at livelihoods. And so the potential is enormous, David. I think it's not about just attracting mainstream capital. It is bringing right instruments, bringing the right platforms. So I don't need, the Green Exchange is great in Luxembourg, and Pierre Gramigny invited me there to speak. But I said, why don't we have an SDG or a social stock exchange where we can list these SDG impact bonds and where we can get a complete democratization of funding? So how do we challenge? And I think one thing that COVID has taught us is that we need to be able to think out of the box. We need to be able to link up with more people, and we need to be able to just get it done much faster.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things that really sticks out to me in what you just said is this.
Only one?
Well, I was going to use one as a segue instead of all 30 that you mentioned. We have this sort of distance between the kinds of financial instruments people think are typically out there for finance and then their utility for the people on the ground. And we've had several questions coming up. One is how do you propose to include the voices of communities and workers in developing plans? Like, where is the voice of the people who are supposed to benefit from these things? And what is the tension between that and this kind of development of financial instruments and this, seeking out of financial actors to participate? And maybe I can put that to all of you, like sort of where someone else asked about democratizing finance. Where do you see the kind of tensions between working with the investment system and working from the bottom up? Amal-Lee, you want to start? Oh, you go ahead, Rudi. You start.
And then I'll hand over to the others. But I think because it sort of links to the last point I made on a social stock exchange, I think that is really answering the democratization of capital. We need to be able to blend different motivations of capital. So there's one capital that's looking for maximizing return. There's another capital that's looking for social impact. And earlier we used to put two hats on. Is it impact first or capital first? And I'm saying in this new world, can we create blended instruments where each of the motivations comes to the fore for that respective player? So Rockefeller says, I'm interested only in the impact. For me, this is important and I'm ready to guarantee it. Unilever says my CSR will come in if I'm able to get X farm productivity up, or Shell Foundation comes in and says if I can get by decarbonization outcomes. So that's, I think, the uniqueness in what we're trying to create, is saying, and these are significantly large if you aggregate them all. Initially, we're looking at $1 million per pop, but that's because I'm using my own balance sheet. But in the next phase, I want to do 10x, so $10 million, and then I will sort of find co-investors along with me. And the third stage, I want to do 100x, and then $100 million bonds, and then list them on the social stock exchange. But again, they will be $100 million, but for 100 enterprises, not for one. And I think that's the key. Because, and that's why so I'm not plugging to Amal-Lee or Nick or Gaurav or Srinu, but we are looking at, raising $10 or $20 million of equity for exactly that, to create this first set of 10, 20 bonds as a pilot, so that we can then go out and tell the world, this is something that can be scaled. And then like microfinance, just hand it over to everyone, and so that nothing is copyright, but just left behind. So it's copy left behind for people to copy.
Mm-hmm. And so the question of sort of staying at a smaller scale allows for the voice of communities to be more present in the design, although there's still probably some tension there between the sort of design of the instrument and the social dialogue. Amal-Lee, where do you all see this, especially as an offshore investor? Sort of how do you see centering the voice of workers and communities in this kind of discussion?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is very interesting. I think what this raises is, how do we bring in, fintech agenda into the just transition, or financing just transition? I've seen some really interesting apps, mainly in China, actually, that sort of, you could call them crowdfunding, but I think it's more than crowdfunding. It's actually about engaging, people from across the country into investing in solutions that are maybe quite far away from them, but about improving water supply in nature-based solutions. So there's a lot of really interesting innovations out there, and I think this is an interesting dimension that we probably haven't really looked at in the context of this project, but is very important. I just wanted to flag also, there's someone who said, how do you really get down to the sort of individuals that are really at the bottom of the pyramid, if you like? And and I think we've seen some interesting, mobile banking has been, in many cases quite groundbreaking, and so technology is enabling the democratization, if you like, of finance, even for those who really have don't even have a bank account. So yeah, I think some really interesting topics that have emerged here, and actually in the Q&A as well on that. But I think that's what, it's also very exciting as well, because technology, I think, is enabling a more distributed economy, if you like. It enables less, a shift away from more centralized systems, whether that's relying on a coal plant or relying on having a central communication system. It's much more sort of distribution, and distributed technologies and systems should provide a much larger number of jobs. I think we saw that in India, that the renewable sector could provide 5 times the number of jobs than the coal industry. And those potentially are going to be distributed all over the country. Appreciate that still need to have a focus on those coal mining areas in particular, in Bihar and Orissa, to see to work with those communities to develop new economic opportunities. But I do think technology, and whether it's fintech, whether it's more distributed energy systems, are actually can provide a lot of social benefits. And that's really, I think, what we need to continue to focus on, and ensure that we're intentionally trying to bring those social socioeconomic benefits and ensuring, job creation, which is likely to be a more sort of equitably distributed across an economy if done well.
Yeah, and those have to be quality jobs, right? It's the question of replacing quality jobs with quality jobs, and also ensuring that technology, I don't think necessarily leads to that outcome, but it can, right? So
it can do. No, of course.
To see how, totally. Rudi, we have so this, you can answer that question, but I'm going to add a little bit on that, also one that came on the role of central banks and public sector finance, sort of like what's the balance of public and private sector finance, or how do you think about that in terms of a just transition, with relation to decarbonization? So one's like the voices from the ground, and then the other is, where does private finance sit in this this mix?
It's a bit of a difficult thing, right? Because I mean, I guess institutional investors generally and shareholders would want to see some return on their investment. And how does one? I mean, I think ROI's impact versus return, right, it's a difficult conundrum that you want. But again, you'd have to find different ways of how one both maximizes the kind of return, but also sees the kind of impact where you have this kind of situation. I mean, who thought that institutional investors and shareholders would take a decision around funding for green transitions? Who thought that large-scale firms would take decisions 10 years ago? It was a very difficult conversation where shareholders were kind of grappling with this, and got into this kind of conversation where they've taken significant steps that large financing organizations or institutions are not going to fund any more coal-powered fire stations. So I mean, one would never think about that. One would never think in South Africa suddenly, 3 of the 4 big banks are saying we're no longer funding or providing private sector funding for coal-powered fire stations, despite the fact that we have 120 years of coal mining left, coal reserves left. And these are the kind of things that I think would be quite important. So for me, I think you have a very different sort of investor, particularly institutional investors, right? So if you're looking at it from a pension fund kind of investment decision, I think these are the kind of conversations that you should have with public sector investment, and private sector investment, where they can play a much bigger role, given that the kind of shareholders that are there are ones who are managing money on behalf of workers and communities, right? And these are the kind of conversations where there's a kind of miss. There's a miss between monies that are being generated for institutional investors through pension fund reforms or through pension funds or retirement funds that are not being directed to the kind of areas that are going to be important for a kind of just transition. And that's a conversation I suppose many of us are having with our retirement funds, if one looks at it from a public sector point of view. It is going to be a difficult conversation to balance that, but I do think it can happen once you have practical projects that are measurable, that that one can fund and one can see the kind of development taking place. I mean, I must be honest. We've seen the kind of investment in the renewable energy sector since 2010, and they've not created a large amount of jobs for us, unfortunately, because a large portion of these kind of jobs are relatively capital intensive work. So you'd have to see and talk through what sort of investments do you want to make. So if it's industrialization and you want to develop a wind turbine industry, or if you want to develop a specialist glass manufacturing sector that looks at glass production to support renewable energy, then of course I think it's going to be important for us to develop it in a much more concerted way, where we can see a value chain approach that is fairly labor intensive, and pays the kind of decent jobs, decent wages that you talk about, David. So I think that's kind of conversation, and it's why it's such a difficult conversation around just transition in South Africa, because we have 10 years of renewable, but we've not seen the kind of jobs which was that many had promised, that we're going to create millions of jobs. We're going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Once you see us moving into the renewable sector, that's not there. And I think this is the kind of difficulty that many workers and communities see, that these are not necessarily labor-intensive jobs, and and the kind of investment that is there. So it's quite a difficult conversation. But again, balancing that between what the investor wants and what communities want, it's going to be a difficult task. It's new ways of trying to develop financing for investment. I just think that, these are new opportunities, very dynamic and new ways of thinking that requires for us to be able to bash our heads together.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like one of the ways to make this discussion tractable is to work up from the level of a project where you model in the project those kinds of social protections and considerations for human rights and community voice that you would want to see elsewhere. Amal-Lee, you may want to respond to that. And also there's a question that came to you about where is the sort of political will in development finance to support this kind of bottom-up approach to projects that Rudi described, and maybe what are the investment risks? Like, where do you see risk in this just transition field?
So, I mean, just responding to Rudi's point, I think, I mean, to be honest, the UK was actually very similar for many years. There was a sort of talk about creating jobs and, this being really beneficial for the UK economy. That wasn't really happening. And that was partly because there wasn't a very clear commitment to renewables by the government in the way that you were seeing in other countries in Europe, in particular, Germany, Spain, Denmark. But actually in offshore wind now, because the UK has made a very strong commitment now, the government, to that particular technology, we are now starting to see a lot of jobs across the value chain for the first time, really. So I think that's also particularly, I think we need to recognise as we're transitioning to net zero economies, we're going to need more and more technologies. It's not like we're just going to be relying on exactly the same technologies over time, and different technologies will be improved and upgraded over time. So the question is South Africa going to be part of that sort of technological transition and leading, in which case it will require more intentional focus to do so, in the way the UK now is doing with offshore wind and other technologies, or be more of a sort of recipient and a follower. And and I think that's really, I think, where where it becomes, if you really want to build an industrial strategy around these types of technologies, that's where you can really start to see a lot of jobs across the value chain. So it's not as simple that if you're deploying solar panels that are manufactured in another country and fitting those, yes, it probably will create some jobs, some jobs for sure, but it won't be the volumes of jobs as you mentioned there. And sorry, David, the other question was around, the question was
sort of, where do you see any risk?
Yeah,
sort of risks around a just transition approach.
I actually personally, I see the just transition approach is a form of risk management, actually, because if we look at what's happening now with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, as investors start to become increasingly concerned about the issue of transition risk, they'll want to feel more confident that economies, sectors, particular companies have got a good grip on the transition and are managing that transition, which, yes, it's about physical assets, but of course, as we're talking about here, it's about workers and communities too. So I actually see it in many respects as part of the management of the transition risk agenda that we see in TCFD that's becoming more and more important. I mean, at the end of the day, nothing is without risk. Walking across the road has a lot of risk. Doesn't mean we don't walk across the road. But I mean, I think as Rathin said as well, I mean, and I think really, it's not, this isn't a new issue per se, in that, ensuring any economic transition has social and economic benefits for all workers and all communities, is essential. I do believe coming out of COVID, and as the COVID pandemic, as Nick, our CEO, said, we have huge opportunity to build that better now. And Placing just transition at the heart of that, hopefully we can really, globally and at the national level, and through development finance in particular, we have an opportunity to really start to do things differently so that we're not just tackling climate change, but we're delivering a much more inclusive economy as well.
Yeah, I like this sort of sense of risk mitigation. That's really one of the instrumental reasons to take up just transition, is that we won't have any transition unless we consider its social effects. Apart from the sort of moral basis that why would you do something without optimizing the outcome for workers and communities? It wouldn't make moral sense. We only have a few minutes left, and I can't resist the temptation to ask for direction. So what I'd like you all to do is, in the near term, what are the near-term opportunities to work on investing in a just transition in your context? So Royston, if you had to place your bets over the next 8 months because you wanted to work on something to advance this discussion in India, where would you focus? And maybe keep in mind, one of the questions that came up here is the kind of tension between depth and speed. We don't want to slow things down too much. We want to get things done, and we don't want to do things poorly. So with that in mind, where would you say we should focus this investing in a just transition discussion in India?
So I think then the outcome-based financing or the SDG impact bonds would be a good place to look at. Not because we are pioneering it, but I think it's because we're saying, how can we bring speed to the table? How can we look at churning out these impact bonds every 3 months, one a quarter? How can we scale these up in a meaningful manner? I want to come back to Rudi's point, and I think I need to call that sort of point about balance he made. And I want to say that it's not really in terms of balancing one or the other. And we seem to have a notion that it's, blended finance, which means that you get a blended return. We need to get full return so that it's exciting capital to come in, but find someone else to pay for that return who is equally motivated by that outcome. So who else is motivated by decarbonization? Who else is motivated by reduction in infant mortality rates? Who else is motivated by water table rising? And get that Coca-Cola or that Nestle or that government of health department to pay for that outcome, so that the risk investor gets their full return. Because that's when the risk return point that Amal-Lee made comes into full bearing. The moment we try to position it as blended finance means blended return or a sort of muted return, that's going to kill the model in itself. So how do we seize the opportunity, David, is the critical one you asked. For example, again, Nick talked about the migrant crisis. They're all running to the villages. Can we create bonds for ponds, where they dig farm ponds so that there's rainwater harvesting, there's employment generation and livelihoods in the villages, and you put less pressure in terms of moving back to the cities and create a livelihood for them there. Now, who is thinking these points? And I come back to Rudi's point on policy. We need to be able to drive policy. We need to be able to influence capital markets, but most importantly, we need to work with social entrepreneurs who are generating solutions at the bottom of the pyramid. So that, I think, is critical if we need to build back not only better, but cleaner, greener, and more inclusive.
Yeah, can't leave the policy out of it. We have 1 minute. Rudi, where should we focus on in South Africa?
I like the idea. I think I mentioned it and you kind of like echoed it. I think it would be useful to look at a project-based approach. And I would say, two particular projects is how we industrialize the renewable energy sector in a manner that I think can create sustainable value chains and participate. But the second one is decarbonizing the east of the country. So there are certainly 3 or 4 power stations that are coming to end of life in the next 3 to 4 years. What happens to those communities and those workers, thousands of workers and communities members who are dependent on that? Is there perhaps a project base that we're able to look at and could fund and get some return on that to develop alternative forms of economic activity there? As Amal says, doesn't have to be energy related, could be something else.
Terrific. Thank you, Amal-Lee. Thank you, Rudi. Thank you, Royston. And thanks everybody for your questions. This was a productive discussion. Nick?
Fantastic, and I'm so glad that we're just at the start of this project, because there's so much energy and so many ideas and really great Q&A and so on. So this is fantastically rich, and I'd just really like to close off really this fantastic session, turning over to you, Saranjali, at NIPFP, and just give your sort of closing remarks and take us to the end. So Saranjali, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I think what sums it up the best is to say that private finance will play an active role in helping us transition. But for all of you who are attending today, thank you very much. And I guess everyone's now asking, what is this project doing? So I'll quickly summarize on what our ambitious plan for just transitions in India and South Africa is. So the concept of just transitions is relatively new in India. But I think the message is fundamental to India's development path. India faces multiple economic transitions at the moment, be it digitalization or moving to a low carbon economy. And I think this presents an opportunity for stakeholders to shape the processes so that they are just, and we mobilize the finance to make this happen. So in a sense, this project speaks to an important aspect of defining the agenda. I think this project seeks to identify how the climate transition can be designed so it brings outcomes for life and also protects most vulnerable to these changes. And we can think of very many impacted, those who will be impacted by this, to include states, regions, in terms of employment. The project, I think, is very novel in that we try to explore how the financial sector and the financial system can respond to these needs. So India has made a significant commitment in terms of its reduction of fossil fuel consumption, and sectors within the economy which are adversely impacted, as we've spoken today about agriculture being an important sector that has been impacted and will also require to transition. I think there will be both public and private finance dimensions. We heard from South Africa as well that public finance does play a role. Of course, there are limits to which it can do this. But I think in Indian context, public finance is even more important because at the moment we collect taxes, duties, and royalties on fossil fuels, which if we were to transition out of these would adversely impact public finance. So in that sense, private finance must step in, and their investors in capital markets must reposition their portfolios and work through how the S in ESG comes to life in the transition. So what we want to do is to build relationships between companies, investors, the public finance, and sort of start a conversation on, gauging the costs that will be incurred and how to deal with it. So our ambition really in 2021 is to define India's homegrown finance roadmap. As Rathin pointed out, that there is also a need to address other inequalities that may exist in consumption, and I think the real advantage of this project is to be able to define India's just transition agenda for the first time by actively engaging with all those who are participating in the process or are impacted by such transition. We are very fortunate to be working across countries with experts. There's a great deal to learn from South Africa. As we've noticed, they've had longer experience in terms of just transitions. So I think through a dialogue with our partners in South Africa, as well as investor community across the globe, from UK and from the US, I think this initiative gives us an opportunity to share experiences and provide India's perspective on the global agenda. So I think the Just Transition Finance Roadmap will be instrumental in charting the course that finance can take to make transition a better one. So that would be my summary of the project, and I hope all of you continue to engage with us on this. Thanks, Nick.
Well, thanks so much, Saranjali, and thanks to everyone who's joined today. It's been really exciting. We will share the PowerPoint and then the contact details of the different teams that are involved, so we can continue the conversation. And this is something we're really looking forward to working with you on to deliver that real action on the ground, as we've heard today. So thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to close this session. So thank you all.